Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks, and today we are studying the Dust Bowl, one of the most horrific time periods in the United States history, and we have had a lot of horrific times, so that's saying something. So the Dust Bowl is also known as the Dirty 30s, but the Dust Bowl is a little more popular of a name. And let's talk a little bit about the basics. Before we can learn about the Dust Bowl, we should know at least some of the basics, I think. So what was it? Well, it's when Americans were drastically coming under attack, and by dusters, or what we call black blizzards. Basically, if you've ever been in a snowstorm, think dust and dirt rather than snow, and that's going to be a pretty horrific thing. So when was the Dust Bowl? Well, that was the 1930s. In fact, it was kind of the entire 30s, but really the highlights were 34, 36, and 39. And we'll talk about why those time periods were worse than everywhere else. But it did end eventually, and that would be 1941, just about the time of World War II. So, hey, let the good times start. Now, why did it end? Because rain came back, and certainly drought's going to play a role in why dust bowls occur. Now, how often did these dusters or black blizzards attack? Well, in the good years, it was every 2 or 3 weeks. That's pretty often. In the bad years, it was every couple of days. It was a nightmare for those people. So here's kind of a chart that gives you an idea of how many. We're talking in its peak years, 60 to 75 dusters or black blizzards were hitting people. I mean, they were disruptive. They were pretty bad. So how intense were these? Well, what you see in front of you is a ton of soil, a literal ton. And that's a literal acre of land. It's almost a football field. Well, every acre of land lost 480 tons of soil in the Midwest. Oh, I'm not sorry, not Midwest, but the Great Plains. I mean, that's pretty disastrous to lose that much soil, that much topsoil. And it all went up into the air and created havoc. Now, where was the Dust Bowl? Well, that was right there. That's where the Dust Bowl was. Now, there were problems related to dust in lots of places in the country in the middle of the section, but that's where the real issues were in those states. So the Dust Bowl in that red area, that would be where it created the most havoc. Now, why would we study the Dust Bowl? Well, it's one of the worst examples of suffering in U.S. history. And of course, and this is a book calling it the worst hard time. We just have endless hard times, and this was the worst of it. So there's some claim that this was such a bad time, and the purpose of history is to study the mistakes we make and the problems we have so we don't face them again. So that's why we're studying the Dust Bowl. Now, you can't choose a different path or do better in the future unless you understand why you did bad in the past. So let's talk about the origins of the Dust Bowl. So either way, before we can study kind of, problems of the Dust Bowl, we have to understand the Great Plains themselves, because that lays the context for this issue. So the Great Plains is where the Dust Bowl occurred, and those are located to the west of the Mississippi and to the the east of the Rocky Mountains. So once again, kind of here, you can see right in the middle section there. So that's the Great Plains, and the southern part of the Great Plains where the Dust Bowl, the major problems would be. And so the Great Plains are 2,000 miles north to south and 500 miles across approximately, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. Now, the Great Plains is pretty much all grasslands, or what some people call prairies. It's super hot in the summers, cold in the winters. Just plain, even kind of boring. Now, that doesn't have trees for the most part. It's kind of completely flat. It doesn't have lakes or rivers, and therefore without the lakes or rivers, no irrigation, so it's incredibly dry. And that often is prone to periods of time where there are massive droughts and high winds for other reasons. So, I mean, this is just a chaos type of place. Now, a conclusion about it is it's hot, lots of droughts, no trees, flat, high winds, no lakes. Now, what the conclusion is, with all of that, this land is not meant for farming. It's not meant for agriculture. The only thing that protects the Great Plains from being absolutely destroyed like it was in the 30s from the high winds and these the black blizzards and whatnot, is the natural grasses. These prairies have so much grass, and that holds down with its roots all of that soil to protect it from all that drought and those high winds. Now, the other aspect of this is over the history, there haven't been any people living there because it's been so dangerous and difficult to farm. And without people, there's no plowing, and that protects these prairies and the plains, the Great Plains. So now that we kind of know what the Great Plains look like and how inhospitable they are, let's talk about how the Dust Bowl happened. There are a lot of reasons why it happened, a lot of origins. So let's talk about the first one. The Great Plains were oversettled, inspired by the government. So the government, in a misguided way, encouraged people to move to the Great Plains. Now, the Great Plains should be empty. They should be. We already talked about why, but European explorers, they were smart. When they looked at America, they saw the Great Plains and saw the sun and they saw the drought. And they actually called it not the Great Plains, but they called it the Great American Desert. Now, that's not what we call it today, but they skipped over it. They didn't settle it. So here's kind of a map showing settlement in the United States and when it happened. And as you notice, we skipped over the middle section. We skipped over the area where the Dust Bowl occurred because it was so inhospitable. The Great Plains, because we didn't settle there, remained plain. They just prairies, grass. Now, the United States was kind of happy with that decision, but in 1862, the U.S. government said, you know what, we're going to pass a law called the Homestead Act of 1862. And it basically offered all that land for free to American families. Now, that was 160 acres of land. Now, I've received a lot of presents. It's never been 160 acres of land. That's 121 football fields of land. And it was given to Americans for free if they went out there to farm it. Or homestead it, they should say. And the homesteaders, by the tens of thousands, ran out to take this free land and populate the Great Plains. Now, in 1909, the government doubled down on what a great idea that was, and they actually offered 320 acres of land for all the remaining land. Once again, Americans flew out there to go get their own land, live the American dream. Now, why would they do that? Well, free land is free land, right? Now, the outcome of this, of tens of thousands of Americans, maybe hundreds of thousands of Americans going out to these inhospitable land is going to be failure. Now, they're all going to go out there and they're going to plow the land and they're going to loosen up that soil, the purpose of plowing, and then the heat of the Great Plains and also combined with the lack of water, is going to make that area completely drought prone. And with the high winds, soil that is part of a drought is going to turn to powder, and those high winds are going to take it up and create dust storms. That's basically what happens. The dirt becomes dust, and that's going to lead to the Dust Bowl, the government having everybody encouraging everybody to go out to these lands where they shouldn't be there and plowing it up. The number two reason why the Dust Bowl occurred was, once again, oversettlement. Basically, it was kind of misleading. With the Homestead Act of 1862, a bunch of people went out there to farm these inhospitable lands. And then it started raining a lot in the 1860s and 1870s, and word got out that the climate had changed. There was this even new concept that people believed, and it's something that people even say today sometimes: rain follows the plow. So because of the 1860s, with all that rain, and suddenly the Great Plains, which were always dry, were really wet, people believe that if you plow areas, somehow it changes something. And suddenly now you'll get rain as long as you plow the land. I don't know if there were religious connections to this philosophy, or just that the exception of those 2 decades, or hope. But some people, the majority of the farmers that went out there believed that if I can farm this, it is more likely to rain. And even more people are going to go out and move out to the Great Plains to farm with this mentality. And they're going to plow it. And we know what leads to that. Plowing leads to loosening up of the dirt. And then with the lack of rain, leads to drought. And that leads to the Dust Bowl. Now, third origin of the Dust Bowl is going to be World War I and overplanting of this land. Now, the reason this happens is during World War I, Europe's men, were soldiering, fighting a war. They didn't have time to farm, and therefore there was shortages of wheat. Now, when there wasn't enough wheat, the price of wheat skyrocketed, and American farmers were like, well, I need to double the amount of wheat I'm producing, not only to help the world, but also to make tons of money. So they went out and got huge loans, and they got a bunch of farm equipment, and they planted as much as they could, twice as much as they could. It was a massive frenzy. And they got rich really quick. They got a lot of money because wheat was worth a lot. But by planting twice as much, they were ripping up all that topsoil and all that prairie grass. Now, when it got time to the 1930s, it's going to get to a time period where it's drought again. And once again, we know what happens. when all that land is no longer protected by prairie grass and there's no rain like the 1930s, the winds are going to take all that soil and pick it up into a bunch of clouds. Now, that's going to lead to the Dust Bowl. Fourth reason the Dust Bowl occurred, once again, World War I led to overcropping, overfarming. Before 1914, Russia provided the world with wheat. But suddenly during World War I, there was a problem. And that problem was that the Ottoman Empire, an enemy of Russia during World War I, is going to block off that wheat. The wheat used to be sent through the, I can't even pronounce the Dardanelles, I think, maybe. And now all of a sudden, the Ottoman Empire blocked that. Russia can't get the wheat out. And now the world can't get wheat, which is a very important component of food, right? So the American farmers stepped it up and planted twice as much wheat that went into it. And now part of that, again, was to provide the world food, but also to get money. Then 10 years later goes by, and we have massive drought, and all that naked land that no longer has that prairie grass, boom, is going to lead to the Dust Bowls, right? The wind's going to pick up that dirt. So the fifth origin of this crisis, once again, World War I. And during World War I, Russia again was providing wheat, right? But then the Russian Revolution occurred. So even 3 years after Russia had limited amounts of wheat that they could get out, they had the Russian Revolution when Vladimir Lenin took over, and they stopped exporting wheat completely. So even more wheat wasn't getting out, and the world pretty much relied on Russian wheat. But again, the American farmers said, all right, we'll triple the amount of wheat that we're making to help out the whole world. And again, they just dug up all this prairie grass, and that's going to come back to haunt them 10 years later in the 30s. So, sixth reason or origin of this crisis is once again World War I and overcropping. So in 1914, American farmers stepped it up. We talked about this. They started planting a lot more wheat, and that was great. But World War I eventually ended in 1918, and now slowly the world didn't need our wheat because their soldiers went back to farming, and Russia went back to normal, and the price of wheat exponentially drops. And American farmers are like, no, I have all this wheat, but it's not worth anything. And it led to massive poverty of farmers in the 1920s. But they got a really good idea, and that was, wow, to make up the money, I'll just double the amount of wheat I'm making again. So they actually went back to the problem and started ripping up prairie grass to grow even more wheat. And they were like, we're going to make money. But the problem was supply and demand. By making twice as much wheat, the demand went down and the price got to be half as much. And when the price went down even more, come 1929 with the Great Depression, nobody had money to buy their wheat. So their wheat was just sitting around, and it was worth nothing anyway. A bushel of wheat went down from $2 to 75 cents a bushel. These farmers were struggling. And yet again, under the Great Depression, they said, well, we can just cut back and plant less, or we can plant more to make up for it. And they just kept doing it. They were under pressure because they had all those debts. They bought all that equipment during World War I, all those tractors. They owed all this money to the banks, and they needed to pay it off. So they just once the Great Depression started, 50,000 acres a day were being ripped up and planted for the first time in thousands of years by these farmers. And that's going to take away the prairie turf for the first time in 35,000 years. It's now gone. Without those grasses, the soil is just naked to the world. And in the 1930s, with all that overcropping and all the drought, the winds are going to take it and create a massive problem, really bringing hell to earth. So that's going to lead to the Dust Bowl. The seventh cause of the Dust Bowl is going to be foreclosures. Basically, in 1929, the Great Depression strikes. American farmers are going to have their farms foreclosed upon. The banks are going to seize them. And those Dust Bowl farmers are going to take off. They're going to leave. They don't have a home anymore. And that's going to leave thousands of miles just naked, thousands of miles of dirt just not covered with crops. And boom, they're not going to be protected by prairie grass or crops. Boom, the drought's going to come, the winds are going to come, and that's going to lead to the Dust Bowl. So again, terrible. Eighth origin of this crisis is technology. Basically, after 1900, tractors became mechanized. Basically, in the 1830s, it took for 1 acre of land 58 hours to plow it, to loosen up that soil. But in 1930, at the beginning of the Great Depression, it took 3 hours. 3 hours with that mechanized plow. So that is unbelievable efficiency. Now you could rip up that prairie grass so quickly and make money off of it, and that's exactly what homesteaders started to do, and we talked about that. They were so efficient with it, and the Great Plains are going to be ripped up, and of course, once the drought of the 30s hits, boom, it's gonna be a disaster. So the tractors had done what no hailstorm, blizzard, tornado, drought, frost, prairie fire could ever have done. The tractors destroyed our farming. Now, the tractors, mechanized plows and whatnot, are going to be a miracle for farming. They're going to make it so efficient. And those plows are also going to be an economic environmental disaster. The ninth origin of the Dust Bowl is just pure ignorance. Basically, this is going to be a very dry area of the Great Plains, and there's very specific things you have to do to preserve liquid, and the farmers aren't going to know this, and they're not going to do it. In the Great Plains, it's so dry that you have to preserve every drop of water. Now, if you don't preserve every drop of water, your soil turns to dust from being dried out. Your crops die, and the soil is unprotected, and the farms fail, and people leave, and then the fields go unplanted. And all of that is a recipe for disaster in these huge dust clouds. Now, what they should have done if they knew proper dry farming techniques, a couple examples was you can't plant all of your crops close together because they'll compete for water and dry out the land, and that will destroy everything. So you need to have bigger spacing between the rows. They didn't know that. You need windbreaks. It's so windy near farms. You need to have trees around it to block the wind, or the wind will pick up and destroy the soil and destroy the crops. You need to have reduced tillage in places where there's not a lot of water. If you keep mixing up the dirt at the beginning of your season to deeply or whatnot, you're going to loosen up the soil to the point where the water can escape, and then therefore it will dry out, and that will create dust, not proper soil. Another example of dry farming would be to cover all of your crops with some type of mulch or straw, which will block the moisture from evaporating and will hold it in. Another example of dry farming is eliminate the weeds. Those weeds are taking water that your crops need, so you can't have thousands or tens of thousands of weeds. You got to pick them, get them out. You also need to furrow your fields. That basically means don't just plant on a flat field. Have furrows, basically huge bumps. And what that does is that allows you to trap the water, so the water can't run off. Runoff is a huge issue. It also has some other benefits that I'm not going to go into now. But again, it allows you to capture the water and or snow and whatnot. Now, all of this ignorance of not doing any of that in the Great Plains for dry farming is going to lead to moisture getting away, and the drought is going to destroy the land. And those winds are going to take drought, all that soil, which is now dust, and fire it up. And of course, that's a problem, right? It leads to the Dust Bowl. 10th origin of the Dust Bowl, deep plowing. During the years right before the Dust Bowl, farmers got the idea that the best way to keep your land moist is to do deep plowing. Now, what that means is to plow more than 20 inches to turn that dirt over at the beginning of the season. And what that's going to do is loosen it up and allow water to get into it, and that's going to preserve water. Well, it turns out it did quite the opposite. Loosening up all that soil allowed water to escape through the loose soil, and it's going to lead to more drought and more consequences and so on. So, Dust Bowl. 11th reason why the Dust Bowl happened, and this is the number one reason out of all of them, the 1930s had a sustained period of drought for 8 years long. Now, this area has always had periods of drought, but never for that long, and it's just going to be awful. And with that drought, the difference here is, basically there's always been periods of drought, but what made this worse was that now the land was naked. The farmers for the first period in history had gone to the Great Plains and torn up so much of those prairie grasses that had been there for thousands of years. Now, when that land all dried out, it could be blown away by the high winds that were always present. So when you combine droughts with high winds and naked fields, now that's going to blow away. And this was the first time that really happened. So farmers are like, hey, the skies aren't bringing rain, only dirt. And yes, that drought is going to be the major cause of the Dust Bowl. And the final thing is, of course, the high winds of the area. But those always existed. We can blame the winds, but that's just part of the landscape. It's tearing up that grass, that prairie grass, and then not having crops always there that led to an issue. Those winds are going to blow up that dirt. And rule of thumb, if your winds get to a point of 40 miles per hour or higher, you're going to have those dust storms, and they did. So now that we kind of understand what caused the Dust Bowl, we're going to talk about its impact so we really understand how it hurt people. Now, the experience of living in these dust storms, number one, the eeriest thing was the sun would be blotted out. Suddenly, within minutes, the sky would just go completely dark. And you could be caught somewhere in your town or in your own backyard, and you couldn't even see in front of your face. So, a few feet in front of you. Now, as a farmer, you needed to get to the outhouse, you needed to get the barn. So a lot of people would hook up ropes going from their front door to these places, and they could just kind of hand over hand get to these places because they couldn't see during a dust storm. Now look, and now this would be an example, all that dust piled up, basically overtaking houses. Now on April 14th, 1935, in Boise City, there was a reporter by the name of Robert Geiger. He's going to call this Black Sunday. Now this is going to be the worst dust storm out of all the 10 years of the dust storms. It's going to be called Black Sunday. It's going to be awful. This is going to be the day where the most people had their homes destroyed. It lasted the longest. The most were hospitalized and killed. Black Sunday was a nightmare. As you can see, look at this. It's like a snowstorm, but it's just a nightmare. So the second aspect that I wanted to highlight was, the dust that was going to hit you was all different types of colors. If you noticed that it was black dust, that was most likely the winds were coming in from Kansas. Red dust, winds were coming from Oklahoma. Yellow-orange dust from Texas, basically. You were getting blanketed by all types of soil from far away. Now, when you woke up every morning, you had to go shovel, just like a snowstorm. Basically, your farm was covered, and if you left it covered, you were done. So look at this, a dust storm had covered the house to that extent. It was as if the earth was swallowing back every man-made creation. It was an absolute disaster. You had to go out with a shovel to just clean off. You could accumulate 4 feet of dust per hour. Think about shoveling 4 feet of snow. I mean, that's a disaster, right? Here's a farmer out there trying to dig out his fence. So fourth aspect, crops just failed in dust storms. The dust would be blown away, and you can't have crops that aren't covered by dust, right? They need those nutrients. But the other happened too, that dust would come up and just pile over and cover up the crops. So crops didn't stand a chance, and when crops fail, farmers get no money. They get no money or crops, they are starving and losing everything. A fifth aspect, if you did have a ranch where you had cows and whatnot, often they went blind. The dust would just whip through their eyes and make them go blind. Cows that couldn't breathe or died of suffocation, they would kind of open up the cows and see their lungs filled with dust. So a lot of people just lost everything, lost all their livestock. Now, this person from the Dust Bowl would talk about birds trying to get away from these dust clouds, flying as hard as they could, and the presumption being that if the Dust Bowl overtook them, that they would then suffocate because you couldn't breathe with all that dust. And that would be what would happen. Over 90% of chickens were killed in one county of Kansas that was reported. Another aspect, people would put Vaseline in their noses to block the dust from getting in. Otherwise, they would have issues. Now, people wore masks just to go to school or to go out. Now, it's weird, and this is the first year where I can actually empathize wearing masks during COVID, but this was a really big deal. You couldn't go outside without covering your mouth and nose. That was a radical idea before the last year. A seventh aspect of the Dust Bowl, these dusters or black blizzards, they would come about you with almost no warning, and all that dust would get into your house. Think about it, the most sacred, safe place you have, your house. That dust would go right down your chimney and cover everything. You tried to put wet towels under the doors and cracks of the house. You took dampened bed sheets and covered windows. You wouldn't put your dinner plates out to the very last moment, or they'd be covered with dust and you'd be eating it. You had to cover cooking pots or the dust would get all into your water. Laundry lines, forget about it. Take it in. So disaster. The eighth aspect is driving. Now, just as kind of a disclaimer here, if you have, I know that these frogs and bears look like they're driving and having a good old time, but that is very dangerous. If you have bears and frogs at home, don't let them drive your cars. Now that said, driving during a duster or a black blizzard, suddenly the sky would go dark and you'd be overtaken. You couldn't see anything. You'd have to pull over to the side of the road or face crashing and killing someone, and you'd be stranded there. There's some journal records of the only way you can make it home is by looking at telephone poles because you couldn't see the road or in front of you. Secondary roads that weren't main roads, would often be completely covered and you couldn't even drive. So another aspect, schools. A lot of times principals would hear that a duster was coming and say, quick, go home, quick, run home before you get covered. In Colorado, in Baca County, schools were closed for weeks at a time often because the dust storms got so bad. There was one example of students being trapped in their school at night. They couldn't escape. And again, they were stuck in the school with no heat or no food overnight. Somewhat tragic. In Kansas, 400 schools were closed permanently. Now, part of that had to do with the dust storms put all the farmers out of business and they could no longer pay taxes. And then, therefore, towns couldn't pay teachers, so schools were shutting down. This was a day when public education was not a guaranteed entity. Now, another aspect was just black snot. Now, I tried to think of a nicer way to say that, but no, it's just snot. People had to blow their nose constantly, and it was just filled with this disgusting dust. Children couldn't sleep at night because they were just coughing endlessly because their lungs were partially filled. Dust pneumonia would be the extreme of that. If you got so much dust in your lungs, you couldn't stop coughing. You couldn't cough it out, and slowly it would kill people. An estimated 7,000 people died from dust pneumonia during this time in the Great Plains. Another aspect, the American Red Cross knew this was going on, so they warned people, don't go outside without a mask. And the American Red Cross would set up cots in schools in every town in this area just so they could help try to heal the people with dust pneumonia, help them or at least die comfortably. That's how sad it was. So the Red Cross went into this area to help people. That's how bad it was. Excuse me, entire towns often would have no tax base because the Dust Bowl completely put everybody out of business. All the farmers failed. And with no money, they couldn't even pay to have lights turned on, or schools, as we talked about. Entire towns often were abandoned and died, became ghost towns. 13th aspect of this, in Kansas, one train even derailed because the tracks were covered with so much dust. The Dust Bowl was so unbelievably bad, but the United States didn't believe it was happening because you don't believe what you can't see. But then the dust actually, in some form of irony, traveled 1,500 miles to the East Coast and actually blanketed New York City. All the dust from way in the middle of the country traveled in the air. And for 5 hours, you couldn't even see the Statue of Liberty because it was covered with dust clouds. Washington, D.C. got hit. And 300 miles off the coast, if you even went further, 300 miles off the coast, ships were hit with hails of dust. So again, America started to wake up that maybe this is real. Maybe this is a thing. 14th kind of aspect about this, during the Dust Bowl, people thought the banks were evil. Because the banks, of course, the farmers were failing, and the banks were the ones that owned their land because they had given them the money to buy the land, and they just foreclosed on tens of thousands of farmers. It got to the point where the farmers were so angry, they were ready to have a revolution against the banks. The banks would seize the land through foreclosure and then have auctions where they auctioned off the land. So what the farmers did was they all got together and they showed up as like a mob of 50, and they threatened everyone and said, nobody here better bid more than a penny for this land. That way the bank can't sell it and can't take it from the farmers. And if outsiders did show up to buy the land, the farmers threatened them with violence and would attack them. Sometimes they were called dime auctions or penny auctions. And here they are, basically making sure nobody buys it. Another aspect of these, dust storms was the migration aspect of it. So the Dust Bowl farmers were down for the count. This was the worst situation ever, perhaps. And the farmers were just broken, and they couldn't eat. They had no food or crops, and massive poverty. So by the tens of thousands, these Dust Bowlers basically abandoned their farms, took off. Now, some had no choice because the banks took their land, but others just walked away from their land, right? 500,000 became homeless. Now, how bad do things have to get where you just abandoned hundreds of acres of land in your home? It got that bad, and they're going to migrate to other towns, other states, but primarily a huge destination was California, which this map kind of shows. From 1930 to 1940, 3.5 million people left their homes and just migrated. And that was the nickname that they got. They were called migrants and whatnot. They took all their possessions, whatever they could fit in their tiny little car, and they took off. They left everything else behind. And there they are. Now, this many people left for California from these states, and it ended up being an estimated 286,000 people migrated to California, and you can kind of see from what states they came. Now, the nickname of these people were called Okies. Basically, after the Okies took all their possessions, put them in their vehicles, and took off for California, right? So the Okies got their name because the most famous area of the Dust Bowl was Oklahoma, but it did impact other states. And pretty much Okies, if you were a migrant fleeing the Dust Bowl, you were called an Okie, whether you were from Oklahoma or not. You were a Dust Bowl migrant. So Okies were headed to California. They had no money. Now, Okies basically became a condescending slur, something pejorative to refer to some really awful part of society and whatnot. So Okies went to California and they went to look for work, but it really wasn't that much better in California. But they were able to find some farms where they could help out, and often they could get these menial, low-paying jobs. And then what they would do is they would set up on the outside of the farms, just set up little tents, shacks, lean-tos, making little shanty towns around these huge farms in California. It was a really high level of poverty. So Californians started to resent all these Okies moving in, and you'd see signs that said Okies and dogs not allowed inside. And Okies no better than a throwaway rag. Now, some people refer to these people as Arkies or Texies based on where they came from, but Okies was the majority nickname. Now, when these Okies went to California, as I already expressed, things weren't all that great there. In fact, California was like, we need to keep these people out of here. They passed a law that it was illegal if you brought an illegal person into the state. And one person or multiple people actually got arrested for bringing their family members from Oklahoma in. So again, here's a sign California put up on their border. There's no jobs in California. If you're looking for work, keep out, stay out. Jobless men, keep going. We can't even take care of our own. So the Dust Bowl was pure, absolute hell for migrants, for everybody involved. Now, in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt got elected, and is he going to save us? You betcha. Well, maybe not save, but certainly going to try to help. His New Deal is going to begin. And the first question he asked himself is, why did the Dust Bowl happen? You can't address the problems unless you know what's causing them. Because he wants to know, should I help these people, try to rebuild, or should I just pay a lot of money to get them out of there? And ultimately, he's going to kind of do both. So New Deal plan number one, and the Farm Security Administration realizes that Americans live isolated lives and only think about themselves quite often. So FDR knew he had to bring up awareness to get people to know what was happening to these farmers, or they would never actually support the New Deal programs because those cost a lot of money. So that's what the Farm Security Administration went out to do. They hired people like Dorothy Lang, not just her, but she became the most famous, and she just took thousands of pictures of people that were suffering because of the Dust Bowl, particularly migrants that were going to California. And if you look at her pictures, you can just see the sadness on their faces. She really got to the heart, inspired empathy, sadness. Remember, there's no internet at this time, so her pictures let people know what was happening. Now, her most famous picture she took in California and was this. This was her most famous picture of Florence Owens Thompson. The name of this picture was Migrant Mother, and it made the country just fall in love with her, basically feel so much pain for her pain, so much empathy that FDR is going to have no problem getting support to help these people out. So here's a couple pictures of her. She was a pea picker in California, and again, very sad with her children. And what Dorothy Lang said about her was that she couldn't find work and she couldn't leave because she sold the tires off of her car for food. And people were just like, this is the saddest thing ever. And it drummed up support, like all of her pictures did. Well, in 1979, they actually found who she was. So again, her name's Florence Owens Thompson, and they found her. And she says, like, yep, that's me. I was in that famous picture that got, published in thousands of places that everybody thinks of when they think of the Great Depression. And she was actually kind of upset. She's like, that made me look like an Okie. Everybody who thought about Okies thought about me, this poor, helpless person that was living off of society. And she was also upset that she never got money for it. It's the most famous picture from the Great Depression. And the Dust Bowl, and she never got money, and all those magazines were publishing it. She also thought that Dorothy Lang lied about her. She said, no, I never sold my tires. I had a job. She just wanted me to seem awful. Dorothy Lang made that up to drum up sympathy, and that might actually be true. So number two, way FDR helped these people is he brought in the CCC, took them from national parks and brought them to where the Dust Bowl was. He brought them into these homes and tore down the houses and took all of these dust drifts and said those are part of the problems. Once you have a dust drift, other dust lines up on it and it never evens out back to the fields. So we're going to get rid of all these man-made structures so the dust just can't pile up on anything. And that's what the CCC did. Now, number 3, the government through the AAA program, Agricultural Adjustment Act, went to these farmers who couldn't afford to feed their animals and just paid them and bought the animals and then just slaughter them, kill them. And this was part of the plan to get rid of all these animals and burn all of this wheat so that the value of it would go up. So the price of these things would go up. So farmers, when they did sell these things, would get more money, and that would help them out. Number 4, FDR's program, the Resettlement Administration. The goal was to completely empty out the Great Plains. We're going to buy up all of these people's lands and give them money so they can settle somewhere else on better land. In the end, it didn't end up working out. Only 2,000 to 3,000 people had their lands bought up in this manner and resettled somewhere else, but it did help some. Number 5, New Deal program, the Resettlement Administration, basically went to California where all these migrants were suffering and built 95 camps for them and trying to help them out so they wouldn't be completely homeless. And it provided them tiny little areas where they could live, tiny little shacks, and gave them running water and so on, so they at least could survive. You know, it wasn't a wealthy existence, but they got some support from the government, some relief. 6th New Deal program, 11.3 million acres of land ultimately was purchased, and the government took that land and tried to repair it, basically planting sod, weeds, grass, so that there would be something holding that dirt down. Now, number 7, New Deal program, 150 camps were established by the CCC. And those CCC camps, 150 of them, had 11-man crews, and they just traveled around all these farms in the Great Plains and planted trees, 6,000 trees per day. 220 million trees were planted by the end of this program by the CCC. Now, the goal here was to create what's called shelter belts, basically these areas of trees growing that can hold down the soil, but more importantly, block the wind to hold down the soil. Today, if you look at farming, you'll see these shelter belts everywhere. And FDR was like, this is part of it. I want to make the Great Plains not inhospitable, but lands like forests. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to fund those shelter belts. And you can see kind of where they were on this map. I mean, that was a lot of trees and whatnot. Now, when the CCC would show up in places, they were treated like firefighters. They were treated like heroes, planting these trees. People loved them. Number 7, the Farm Security Administration is going to purchase all this inhospitable land and actually is going to take farmers and move them, resettle them onto collective farms, kind of like the Soviet Union was doing at the time. The government created 34 farm communities that included 104,000 families where the government put them together and they worked on government farms. Now, and during that time, the government taught them farming techniques like we talked about earlier, so they wouldn't do destructive practices and they could contain moisture and whatnot, kind of like that furrowed crops where you don't just plant flat land, because if you furrow your crops, that the wind isn't going to blow all of that soil away and it's going to hold moisture in. So it's going to give these farmers a fresh start. Now, that program doesn't last that long because collective farms reminded everybody of communism in the Soviet Union. But during that time, it really saved a lot of people and taught them how to farm. Now, the legacy of the Dust Bowl is the High Plains never recovered. There are so many areas and aspects of it that those prairie grasses are just gone. The topsoil is gone, and it's just completely inhospitable at this point. It just never recovered. The dirt never returned. And that's a very sad thing. Now, what are the lessons we can learn from the Dust Bowl? Because we're almost done. Now, the whole point to studying history is to learn from it so you can make better choices in the future. And so let's see. Number 1 lesson that I would find is we just went over all these causes of the Dust Bowl. But do you know what one of the prevailing wisdom of the people of the Dust Bowl was about why they were suffering so much? Was because the international level of Jews had destroyed the financial system, caused the Great Depression, running the banks, and were foreclosing and taking all their lands. And the Jews were the number 1 hated group at this time. They were blamed for this. Now, what is the lesson of this? That was so completely false that you have to absolutely identify what your biases and prejudices are, because your biases will completely overwhelm any rational sense you have. And the fact that these people were blaming the Jews for their problems just demonstrates the weaknesses, our blind spots. So I guess what I would encourage you to do is find your biases, no matter how big or small they are, and realize how they're impacting you. And I don't mean massive, huge prejudices, but just we all have biases. And if you're unaware of what yours are, they probably are making you act in an irrational manner at some point. And that's a negative. So you need some self-awareness. That's kind of what I gathered as a lesson about that form of prejudice that I saw. Another lesson, we need to be aware of the flaws of capitalism. What did Herbert Hoover do? He said, we're just let capitalism play out. Capitalism goes up and down. It's a good thing when the system gets rid of the losers, the people that are doing a bad job, and basically survival of the fittest. And I guess my lesson here would be, no, capitalism doesn't just go up and down. All the people suffering here stay down, and they stay down for over 10 years, even 20. And that capitalism is by itself has this weakness. People don't necessarily bounce back, and that you need the government to come in and support people and help them get on their feet. And if the government does come and help people out, which is kind of a socialist principle, once they get on their feet, they can do amazing things, just like the farmers did after the FDR helped them out here. So I guess my lesson is capitalism is wonderful, but pure capitalism is flawed. There is a role for the government to support people that can lead to a greater future. Another lesson, embrace public education, because we didn't really have that in the 1920s and 30s across this nation. And one of the reasons we got into trouble here was farmers thought rain follows the plow, that if they just plow their lands, somehow, scientifically speaking, that would bring rain. Now that type of ignorance and lack of education is going to destroy and cause so much misery and lead to the Dust Bowl, that we need a strong public education system in this country to make sure people are educated well enough to not make poor decisions. And a lot of times public education comes under attack, and I would say we need to invest in it as much as possible to avoid major mistakes like this. Now, another lesson is the human race actually has the potential to destroy the earth. The Dust Bowl was completely man-made. It wasn't just a bad cyclical year of drought. It was farmers making bad choices, destroying lands that allow the Dust Bowl to occur. And if you think that collectively the human race can't destroy the earth because it's too big and powerful, I think that's a mistake. And I think we have to really put a lot of care into what the human race is doing today to the earth, because it can create massive problems that will have terrible impacts. And finally, well, I guess the lesson I would curate from the Dust Bowl was people were so quick to act in a prejudicial manner, not just to Jews, but to the Okies. The Okies were deemed like the scum of society, these poor people that were coming into their lands, like in California, begging. And really, we shouldn't be that quick to judge people. A lot of the Okies had their own farms, 160 acres. They ran their own businesses. They were wealthy. And because of problems that weren't directly their fault, the Dust Bowl came up and destroyed their farms. They ended up with nothing. And people judged them so harshly and treated them so terribly. And we just have to check our ability to judge people, because just because of their circumstances, people are not always responsible for their circumstances. And we should not be so quick to judge them for them. I think that's kind of a lesson from all the judgment and harsh treatment that went towards the Okies. So in conclusion, if you want to know more about the Dust Bowl, culturally speaking, there's a great novel. The most famous novel is called The Grapes of Wrath, by the same author that wrote Of Mice and Men, that really gets to the heart of what life was like for a migrant during the Dust Bowl. The most famous painting was called The Drought Survivors, and that kind of depicted the way people thought of the Dust Bowl. Dorothy Lang has thousands of pictures, and her pictures kind of depict what was going on with the migrants in the Dust Bowl. That's kind of her legacy. And Woody Guthrie is the most famous musician. He wrote a whole album, I think, in 1941 with songs totally dedicated to explaining what life was like during the Dust Bowl. So if you have Spotify or something else, you could give it a listen. And that is kind of our discussion as related to the Dust Bowl. So look at Google Classroom to see what your related assignment is. Thank you.